Okay, it's almost time, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay, let's start. Welcome all to this Clubhouse event co-hosted by Hong Kong Professional Network, HKPN, and Hong Kong Books Curators, HKBC. HKPN is a group of overseas Hong Kongers trying to help each other to settle down in their new country through offering assistance in job search, applications to colleges, and other volunteer work. HKBC is a small group of volunteers who want to preserve the unique culture of Hong Kong, more specifically, but also the Chinese language and culture in the broader terms, in light of the huge change happening in Hong Kong in recent years. We might be too bold to call ourselves curators, but we are inspired by the museum curators in Afghanistan who walked the extra mile to save their museum pieces during the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989, and again in 1992 to 1996, protecting these valuable artifacts from being destroyed by the Taliban. We want not to honor, we not only want to honor the important work they did, but also their footsteps and play a small role in preserving the history and culture of a beloved hometown, Hong Kong. To promote the awareness of the book that are important to Hong Kong, we decided to host a clubhouse event and hence borrow the venue of the club that Kitty and I co-managed. Here we are again. It is a bilingual club. We follow the convention that if the event is in English, our event title will be written in English. If the event is in Cantonese, our event title will be in Chinese. So we decided not to provide an instant translation into Cantonese this time to allow a better flow of the chat. The first part of the show will be a conversation with our guests. And in the later part of the show, listeners can join us in the speaker session to ask questions by raising their virtual hands. While you have answered your questions, please return to the audience session if you don't have a follow-up question. Now, let me introduce our team here today. Alison, Kitty, and Xiu and I will be the moderators of this event. A very pleasant Carmen will be our main host for our speaker, Jeffrey Wasserstrom. He is an American historian with a strong interest in modern China. He is also the writer of the book, Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink. Now, let me pass the baton to Carmen, and let's get started.
Thank you, Esso, for getting us started. Thank you to everyone who's joining us here on Clubhouse today. And thank you, Jeff, for being here today to talk to us book Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink, and your thoughts on what's on in Hong Kong.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with your book. I know you have written quite a few books about modern China, but what compelled you to write this book, Vigil?
So I didn't think I would write a book about Hong Kong. I've been going to Hong Kong. I had been going to Hong Kong as a visitor since 1987. And I went there midway through a year that I was spending in Shanghai doing research for my dissertation, which was on Shanghai student movements. And so I went to Hong Kong then as a kind of break from my research, though it was in fact the first place that I gave a presentation about my research on the mainland was in Hong Kong there. And then I kept going to Hong Kong periodically when I would be on my way to China or coming out of China. And I was intrigued by the way the city changed, the way it changed between 1987 and 1996 when I was there next, but then also the way it would change during many years after the handover when I went through there. I then became fascinated by the city as a place to write about, as opposed to simply someplace to enjoy going and to enjoy spending time. Really in the 2010s, when I started to notice that there were the protests that were going on in Hong Kong then were more like the protests that I had begun my career studying, which were protests of the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and 40s on the mainland, and also the protests of the 1980s that I had witnessed some of and written about as well. Those had really disappeared from the mainland. There was no longer a way that when I went to a campus on the mainland, I would see the kinds of protests that reminded me of what I had first studied. So then the idea started to come into my mind of writing about parallels between Hong Kong's struggle and the struggles on the mainland before 1949 and on the mainland in the 1980s. And so then I started writing short pieces about Hong Kong, and I still didn't think I would write a book. I was working on another book project, which now I'm back to now, about the Boxer Uprising of 1900 and the different ways that story is told. But I just found the events in Hong Kong so compelling. I got to know some of the people involved. I got to watch some of the protests. And I just felt like it was a story that it was very important to tell. And it was a story that I thought it was important to tell in ways that would communicate with people in other parts of the world who were not necessarily paying attention to what was going on there. And I thought the fact that I had done comparative work on protests and authoritarian struggles put me in a good position to tell the story in a specific kind of way.
Right. So the book itself is pretty short, but it tells a very, very clear story of what led to the protests in 2014 and eventually in 2019. And it covers a lot of ground. And like you said, you mentioned a lot of parallels in the book to what's going on in Hong Kong right now. But your book has been out for over a year now. What do you think are some of the biggest changes that happened in Hong Kong since your book came out?
So there's been enormous changes, and sadly, I think the book ended with a kind of it ended on a quite sad and pessimistic note. I finished writing it in October of 2019, and I wrote that I didn't know what would happen next. Throughout the book, I talk about how hard it is to predict what's going to happen in Hong Kong and how wrong Hong Kong has made, how often Hong Kong has made fools of forecasters. So I wanted to avoid making any specific predictions. But I ended by saying that I didn't see anything on the horizon that would stop Beijing from exerting tighter and tighter control over the city. And that was a pessimistic kind of note. And then right after I finished writing, there were the November 2019 district elections, which I thought might be canceled. They weren't canceled, and they were swept by pro-democratic forces. And I actually thought at the end of 2019, I was back there briefly in December to see a very inspiring protest on December 8th, a very big one. And I thought maybe I'd ended on too downbeat a note. But then the events of 2020 and early 2021 have alas made that kind of negative note right on target. So I think what we see is a ratcheting up of the processes that were underway already. There was a series of attacks on the things that made Hong Kong distinctive and separate and held it different from mainland cities. And I think we've seen a push and pull for a decade now, that we can really say a full decade, because it was in 2011, 10 years ago, that the first moves to try to introduce, to talk about bringing in patriotic education, that were an assault on the different kind of education system, and that we see a series of tightenings and then pushback by people in Hong Kong. And what we've seen in the last year has been a steady set of tightening with more limited space for pushing back. So there still is resistance, but I think the story has become one in the last year, more a story of repression than of resistance, and of resistance having to take subtler forms and not being able to take street actions.
Right. So you mentioned a little bit about the difference between Hong Kong and other major cities in China. And in chapter 1 of the book, you use the SIM card, the telephone SIM card, as an example to describe Hong Kong's evolving identity. And you quote Jonathan Choi Kun Sham, chairman of the local Chinese General Chamber of Commerce, saying, quote, "We will no longer be Hong Kong people, but Greater Bay Area people." Do you think this statement is now being actualized?
Well, I think there are pressures for that to happen, but obviously there's resistance to it. And I think there will continue to be Hong Kong people who are intensely concerned about their Hong Kong identity. And the Hong Kong identity is also being kept alive very, very strongly in the diaspora and in different places. And I think actually that's something else that's important about the last year, is that we've had an increase in activity outside of Hong Kong when space within Hong Kong has become more limited, and all of you are part of this process. And I would say that I think, I was hesitant about writing a book about Hong Kong, in part because I don't speak Cantonese, and I haven't made the deep investment in Hong Kong, in studying Hong Kong, that some other people have who've written about the city and whose work I think is invaluable, and I see myself in dialogue. But I think what I bring to it that's different is this kind of comparative view. And part of that comparison is to think about similarities and differences with the mainland. But some of it is to think about similarities with other times and places. And one of the things that we've seen in other times and places is efforts to stamp out a local identity often lead to a more intense identification with that identity outside of the place. So it's not the first time that we've seen people in other parts of the world keep alive elements of a struggle when it can't be held in that place. And we see this in colonial settings in many parts of the world, including in parts of Asia about a century ago, when you had people from Vietnam and other countries that were under colonial rule keep alive the traditions and the identification with the place while in transit, while outside of there, while sometimes in exile. And I think that's something that is a process going on now. There certainly is integration of the different parts of the so-called Greater Bay Area going on. Some of it was going on at earlier times too. There were people living in Shenzhen and working in Hong Kong. There was a way in which there was a limiting of the difference. The internet is one of the things that still does mark a difference, but it's one of the things that's under assault, and it's one of the things I think to be watched right now. But we've seen some of the things that were in the book. I talk about the way in which I knew when I had arrived in Hong Kong I was someplace very different from a part of the mainland where I'd been. And one of the things that was a marker of that was looking at newspaper stalls and seeing newspapers that had very, very different front pages. Whereas on the mainland, there would tend to be a similarity in the pages. And that's one of the reasons why the end of Apple Daily is such a significant kind of marker of that. I think there still is a marker of that difference by going on the web in Hong Kong versus other places. I think the lessening of the difference, one of the places I wish I had actually talked about a bit more in the book, though I do talk about it some, is Macau. Because Macau has been a place that has been different from the mainland, but also different from Hong Kong. And I think where the vision of some of the Greater Bay Area visionaries were wanting to see a Hong Kong that became less politically vibrant in the way that Macau is less politically vibrant, and a place where there could be differences, but the differences would largely be economics and how you made and spent money, which is very different in Macau than it is on the mainland. But Macau itself in the last year has also been facing tightening of control. In Macau, typically there have been small vigils held on June 4th, and this year they were banned there. There's been a photographic exhibit that would show images of Tiananmen that were banned on the mainland. So I actually thought it was a problem. Sometimes people would say Hong Kong was the only place in the People's Republic of China where there could be any discussion of Tiananmen. I think it was actually important to pay attention to Macau, there being some but less, because that was that should have alerted us to the fact that this could happen in stages, that there could be this kind of erosion, which I think is what's going on.
Right. So you just said something that to me. You said there has been some increase in activity outside of Hong Kong. And in the last chapter of your book, you talked about the limited international concern about Hong Kong's fate. And I quote what you wrote in the last chapter. You said, viewed within a 100-year framework, the limited international concern about Hong Kong's fate is deeply worrying. So can you talk a little bit more about that, and what would an adequate level of international concern look like to you? And how can we, the Hong Kong diaspora, can help get more international attention?
That's a really, it's a great question. It's one that I think about a lot, and I think it's difficult. And I think the last year has in some ways made it more difficult because the distraction of the pandemic and the concern, the fact there are so many problems, but also the fact that there are more obviously dramatic forms of repression and resistance going on in some other places like Burma. And so I think there are, it's very hard. It's very hard. I think one of the ways, and I think people have been doing this some people have been doing it quite effectively, is to just find a way to convey the significance of what's going on without sensationalizing it, or without falling into a trap of sensationalization and pushing back against that. I mean, I listened this morning to Karen Chiang's episode on This American Life, in which she talks about wrestling with the idea of whether to leave or to stay, and how difficult that is, and how subtle the process can be. I think this is one of the challenges to convey, that how do you convey the stifling of things that were very important about Hong Kong, and yet be aware that there haven't been the obvious signals of what the world would see as the utter catastrophic one. The Chinese Communist Party has, I think, been very shrewd, and its supporters within Hong Kong, that there haven't been there haven't been tanks on the street, there haven't been shootings in the street, and I think it's important to somehow find a way to describe it without falling into the trap of playing this game of sensationalism, which I occasionally do see on social media when people who understandably get frustrated about the limited international attention will say things like, there are many, many martyrs. I think it's important that there was police violence. I think there are statistics that you can bring up that speak that speak to the seriousness of it. But I don't think it's useful to use terms like Chi-Nazi, which play into a kind of hyperbolic language. I think it's important to just convey things in a kind of positive sense about what was so precious about Hong Kong. And I think there are just stories to tell that do that. And I think there are stories to tell that actually, to me, one of the most powerful stories is that Hong Kong did represent another version of what Chinese culture was. Elements of Chinese culture that were very different from the Chinese Communist Party's version. And in some ways were seen internationally as more attractive, and to continually remind people of that, to remind people of just how attractive Hong Kong film was, how attractive a place that allowed more creativity was able to be both linked to Chineseness but to a very different and even resistant form of Chineseness to what the Communist Party was about.
Right. So whether to stay or to leave Hong Kong right now is like the hot topic. People have very strong opinions either way. And we also see that in countries like the UK, Canada, and Australia have programs now that make it easier for Hong Kong people to immigrate there. So do you think these are helpful to the cause, and do you think there are other ways that the international community can help the people in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I think to help is a very, I mean, I think these initiatives are very important, and I think we need to think about a time when there will be ways in which this struggle is being kept up, both by people inside Hong Kong, and to have respect for the people who make the decision to stay and the people who make the decision to leave. And I think, this is one where to look at as many different models of the past and what's worked for other populations, none of which are exactly the same, but some of which may have things in common. So I think to think about what has worked for Tibetans creating an exile, and what should be avoided. I mean, from different exile communities, to try to avoid infighting, which is something that happens periodically, that happened with the Tiananmen exiles at certain points. How can you learn from what works and also avoid what hasn't worked, and to think broadly about what the models can be. And I think there are some one thing I bring up in the book that I think this could be useful. I mean, it's easy to naturally think about examples within Asia, and those are important, and Taiwan. These are all places that are useful to think with. But I think it's also useful to think with the example of the Soviet bloc during the Cold War, and how people kept things alive. And I found it very moving to read in 1981, Solidarity in Poland had a very large uprising, and it was crushed, and a period of martial law set in. And Adam Michnik, one of the leaders of the leading journalists of the movement, was offered a deal by the Polish authorities. They said they would let him out of jail if he left Poland behind and just stayed away. And he wrote about why he had decided to stay, and made the decision that was the way for him to have the commitment. But there were other people who left and were very useful in what they could do in spreading the word or keeping alive certain spirit of resistance outside of there. And some of them wrote very powerful books as exiles that managed to reach an international audience in ways that perhaps those within the country were not always able to do, because they could develop these skills. I think one of the things that Hong Kongers have an advantage is that that it was already a city defined so much by kind of international flows and cosmopolitan trajectories. So I think in some ways for the diaspora, it's simply finding ways to stay in touch with what was always most special about Hong Kong, and that includes, I think, the parts to celebrate. There should be an awareness of the fact that Hong Kongers can come from very different classes, or can come from different ancestries, can have different ethnicities, and to remind people of that is yet another way to emphasize how Hong Kong was something precious that that the Chinese mainland is not. That you could be a Hong Konger even if you were not of ethnically Chinese descent, whereas on the mainland incredibly, it's really blocked for you to
Right.
be seen as a full member of that community. I think that's something that Hong Kongers, within Hong Kong, it's valuable to celebrate, and outside of Hong Kong, to keep that alive. So I think perhaps one thing that Hong Kongers in exile can do is just simply draw attention to the many different things that being a Hong Konger can mean.
Right. Right.
Talking about exile community, that I've been hearing a lot of people saying that, especially Hong Kong people saying that to mimic the Jews, and then where the Jews have so much cohesiveness that through the thousands of years they can rebuild their country in the Middle East. And how do you think that the Hong Kong people's cohesiveness and compares with the Jews, and then whether like Hong Kong people, like what can Hong Kong people have in order to have that kind of cohesiveness of the generation of people that they can rebuild the country, rebuild the city, maybe.
Wow, that's really interesting. So I'm of Jewish ancestry, though I'm not religious in any way. And I've thought a lot about Judaism, but I've thought about it a little bit differently. Actually, what I've been thinking about is, as somebody of Jewish ancestry, I can say, and other people I know can say, that we relate to being Jewish, but we're anti-Zionist, or that we're completely against the policies of the state of Israel. And I think right now there's a challenge for people of Chinese ancestry globally to find a language to criticize the Chinese Communist Party's view of a single notion of what Chinese culture is, and to come up with the kind of equivalent to that, which is to push back against the claim by Beijing to be able to speak for all people of Chinese descent. And I think this is a very complicated issue for Hong Kongers, which I think is a hard thing to navigate, because people from Taiwan, different Taiwanese are grappling with it in a similar way. Is the noise from Beijing is so loud about trying to define Chineseness, that one temptation is to reject Chineseness as any part of an identity. But I actually think that in some ways there can be a value in connecting with other diasporic communities of Chinese descent who also feel alienated from the Chinese Communist Party's version of that Chineseness.
Yeah.
So I think both of those can, but I do think looking for parallels wherever you can find them, if there's not that any one will fit, but is there some specific element of how a particular diaspora group has seemed to succeed well, is worth looking for models.
Oh, I have
Yeah. This is.
to, sorry, I have to apologize that I should have used the word Jewish, and then, I took back the words earlier.
No, that's fine. No, I think it's fine. I understood what you meant. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Sorry.
Sure.
Carmen.
Thanks, Axel, for the question. So this is really interesting because, like, we want to find a language, a way to express our Chineseness, but even as simple as the word Chinese, it seems like the Chinese government is monopolizing on this word. Like when you talk about Chinese, everyone thinks about China, and because the word is from China, so it is very, very difficult to find a language that can unify us who don't identify with Beijing.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and it's actually one of the things that's interesting is that one of the ways to compete with Beijing that some in exile have done from the mainland has been to accept the unitary view of Chineseness, but just kind of create a reverse image of the Beijing version. So the Shen Yun pageant that is supported by Falun Gong, that has 5,000 years of culture. It actually buys into the same notion of unitariness. It just
Right.
says that that Beijing doesn't represent it. I'll give you. I mean, I know you might be asking me for suggestions of things to read about Hong Kong, but I was going to mention there's a valuable book to read and work being done by Gregory B. Lee, who has started a very new kind of Chinese studies program.
In London,
Well, he's up
the UK.
in Scotland, in
Right,
St.
St.
Andrews.
Andrews. Yes.
St. Andrews. And he has, he talks about encouraging students to learn multiple Chinese languages. And you can have a concentration in Pearl River culture. So there's a way of breaking up that notion of a single unified one. And I think recovering that sense of the fact that there's something kind of arbitrary and actually quite recent about this idea of a single unified Chinese culture. I mentioned I was working on the Boxer uprising of 1900 for this new book. And I was reading something by the American ambassador, basically the Qing ambassador to the United States in 1900, or diplomats. And they were saying that they were concerned that anti-Chinese sentiment would, because of what the Boxers were doing, attacking Christians in China, they were afraid that there would be prejudice or attacks on Chinese in Chinatown. And they said they would be quoted. They would talk about, no, you can't think of that, because in fact, the people who have come from China to the United States largely came from southern China. They speak a totally different language. They have no sympathy with the North China villagers who are carrying out this violence. You shouldn't think of these as being part of the same culture. So that I thought was a very interesting way in which of talking about the differences in culture. So one of the ways, it's not a perfect thing because of the geopolitics, but I think the emphasis of new work on Cantonese as a language and culture and cultural forms. Gina Tam has a new book on that. I think that's one of the things that also is a resource to think about, of ways to connect to that. And I've actually found that in giving talks about Vigil, when I could on campuses before it came out, I would occasionally have students in the audience who were from the mainland, but were from Cantonese-speaking families. And they said that in discussions about Hong Kong, they sometimes felt caught in between, because there would be a lot of discussion of Hong Kongers versus mainlanders, and the stereotypes going in each direction. But they felt that they were in a kind of in-between space, because they had divided loyalties with that. But I think emphasizing that variability is also something that can be a resource.
Right. Very interesting. And talking about the different culture, Cantonese, the language and the culture, I've noticed there have been different publications, even literary journals that are focused on the Cantonese culture coming out over the last year or so. So that's very encouraging to hear. So I'm going to switch gear here and talk about the national security law and the freedom of speech in Hong Kong right now. So since July 2020, in the wake of the national security law, the Hong Kong government has started removing books by pro-democracy figures from public libraries. And with the shutdown of Hong Kong's last remaining pro-democracy Chinese newspaper, Apple Daily, a couple of weeks ago, more books have been pulled from library shelves. So for you, Jeff, as a historian and a writer, what do you think about all of these?
It's deeply concerning to me. It's deeply concerning. But I mean, as a historian, I also think about how, and as somebody who's worked on the mainland in the past, I think it's really important to note some parallels in how this is going on versus how it went on in the mainland. So in the mainland, the tendency has been for the government to be most concerned about the kinds of cultural products, cultural ideas that reach the largest numbers of people. So they've had a tighter control on television, for example, than on art house movies, and a tighter control on nonfiction, or sort of they've had a tighter control on publications in Chinese than publications in foreign languages often. And I think we've seen that coming into Hong Kong. You know, the
Right.
fact that Headliner, the satirical television show, was forced off the air before Apple Daily was closed down, and the fact that at least until recently, Joshua Wong's the English language version of Joshua Wong's Unfree Speech was available in Hong Kong, but the Chinese language editions had been
Right.
removed from libraries. So I think what we see is this effort, and I think it's very important to be aware of that so that we don't get fooled by, I mean, this is the kind of way that I think we need to educate international audiences, because what can happen is if an international tourist, say, or business person goes to Hong Kong and says, oh, look, I can still see, I can still buy the New York Times if it's available. Whereas
Right.
on the mainland, it's harder to get. Then I think it's important to educate and say, well, wait a minute, what we need to say is, what is the tightening of the control of the things that are most accessible to the most people? So
Right.
what's being blocked on television? What's being blocked? So, and to realize that there can be this kind of creation of a dual world that can fool people. And this has fooled some people who go on short trips to the mainland and come back and say, you know, it
Right.
wasn't that restrictive. I was able to see this. I noticed that there were times in the early 2000s when there was a looser feel in the mainland where none of my writings have been published in Chinese translation on the mainland, but I could occasionally find something that I had a chapter in English, in an English language book that was for sale in a foreign language bookstore. Because
Right.
the government wasn't that concerned about what a smaller segment of the population that might read something like that would
Right.
would do. In the same way, they've allowed up to a certain point subtler or more indirect forms of fictional works that have implied criticism of the government. These can be published in fiction, whereas a tighter control is put on nonfiction, and a tighter control on things in language that's more accessible to ordinary people, a tighter control on texts that are accessible to children. It's no accident that there's a focus on trying to control things in the schools. And one of the ways that the Chinese Communist Party, the language they use for a lot of their censorship is very similar to the language used in other parts of the world for pornography. And that, of course, you need to keep the most susceptible people from being exposed to this. That's something that's been going on in Singapore for some time as
Right.
well, where there's a control of things that directly challenge the authorities, but then allowing a lot of other kinds of things to be available so that people don't think of it as a complete police state.
Right. So you talked a lot about like parallels in other places in history, and in various parts of the book, you also compare the recent protests in Hong Kong with the May 4th movement in China in 1919, and as well as the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? What is unique about the movement in Hong Kong in comparison to these other parallels?
I mean, I think there are special things about it because of the moment that it's taking place. It's taking place in a very interconnected world where, I mean, all of those movements were affected by international flows, but the speed with which tactics, symbols, images are circulating are very different now. And the degree of cosmopolitanism within the movement, the borrowing of songs and images from different places, and the way in which Hong Kong is influencing other places as well, I think is new about this. But I think the parallels in some ways are I think of the struggle as having a lot in common with anti-colonial movements in the past, anti-authoritarian movements in the past. And there's an irony to this because many of the themes of youthful resistance against local authorities who are bowing down to strongmen in a foreign capital. Those were things that when the Chinese Communist Party was founded 100 years ago, the young activists of that moment were saying exactly those things about the warlords in control in Beijing, who were being too accommodating to the bullies in Tokyo, that now young Hong Kongers were saying about figures like Carrie Lam being too ready to do the bidding of the new imperial power in Beijing. And I think so. I think thinking in those terms is it's useful because I do think Carrie Lam in some ways isn't. I mean, she's a different figure and somewhat an exotic figure, but it's not like we haven't seen people in those situations before who end up claiming to be protecting a local community, but actually largely taking directives from outsiders. That's something that you see in a lot of colonial settings, where you saw in the Soviet setting, where Moscow would be giving directives to countries that were under the Soviet umbrella. So I think it's worth thinking about the protests in Hong Kong and resistance is fitting into these longer patterns.
Right. So we have about 18 minutes left, and I want to open up the floor for questions. And I see Anna is already in. Anna, do you have a question for Jeff?
Yes, nice to meet you, Jeff. And
Nice to meet you too.
Yes, and thank you so much for the sharing. We mentioned, we as in, the Western world, have been using terms like diaspora, space, diversity, right? Very much in the past few years, and even in relation to the city of Hong Kong. But as much as we've used this word so many times tonight, do you believe that the state of diaspora is still going to sustain? Or are you looking at, it's slowly becoming a real, something more like a monolithic congregation even, right? Because of communistic reform or engineered propaganda from the level of, children's education to occupational loyalty to media unity or unanimous opinion in the media, as well as slowly becoming of the state military type power? Or do you think actually this is going to be the fuel of a more diverse diaspora even, but just maybe in the cyber world or spinning off into the Western world, outside of the region, just so much like nomadic cultures did? I'm just I grew up there, but I haven't been back in a very, very long time. And I'm also I was trained in the media. I'm doing critical discourse study, and judging by the whole discourse being framed, right, from making people take oaths to keep their jobs, from framing how the media talks and framing how politicians speak, framing textbooks and educational curriculum. Do you think it is going to be a successful shrinking of the diaspora or the space to think and act and speak and behave? or is it going to be, just going to be, triggering or fueling the opposite because of defensive reactions?
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. That's a very sophisticated way to put the question. I'm really there have always been limit. If we think of this as a colonial project, I mean, there are always efforts by colonial regimes to kind of stamp out notions of local difference, and it always stays alive in small. There are always cracks. This is Leonard Cohen's line. There are always cracks, and that's where the light gets in. And it's always different. And I think the same is true with totalitarian systems. Totalitarian systems are never totalizing. There's always places of difference, whether these are kept alive in family stories or in kind of subtle ways that even people within the system that have small degrees of resistance. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that in many of even the kind of most nightmarish dystopian visions, you have some pockets of resistance. And so, we can think about this with, I mentioned in the Soviet umbrella system, places like Poland and Hungary, they kept alive their sense of difference. But some people have said I really should be talking more about the actual republics within the Soviet Union itself. But there too, these things were kept alive, that after decades and decades of Moscow trying to impose a fairly unified view on the country, once there was space again, you had people reclaiming Estonian and Lithuanian and Latvian identity in a way. And we've seen, even in this kind of one of the most totalizing, most repressed parts of the PRC, Tibet, you have ways in which people are managing to keep that sense of identity alive. And actually, this is something I think if it's not easy, but for Hong Kongers to try to convey, I think the international community, not that it's helped Tibet, I think the international community has an easier time wrapping its mind around the way that Tibetans feel alienated from or separate from the People's Republic of China because of religion is something that the international community can relate to in a certain way. If Hong Kongers can somehow convey that their attachment or their sense of difference is as rooted in many different aspects of life than maybe that for some people religion is. And even actually, I think it's done a slight disservice to the movement that there hasn't been as much attention paid to the role of religiosity in some elements of the movement in Hong Kong. I think that's part of the story that's actually been played down perhaps too much there. But thanks for that question. It's really it's a complicated one.
Thanks, Jeff.
Sure.
While waiting for another audience to raise their questions, I wanted to put an advertisement here. 又係呢度, here we are again. It's a club for the promotion of Hong Kong culture. And then we will have a series of lectures and talks about the Hong Kong's culture and then in the meeting room. So I encourage you all to follow the club 又係呢度, here we are again, and encourage you all to follow the speaker today. And then while we are waiting for the other questions, I have a question for Jeff that you talk about sense of identity, right? As a Hong Konger, I feel that my sense of identity is rooted in the language, Cantonese, and the movies and the music. And then for you as American historian, what area of the sense of identity is like most distinguished from the other culture that you feel that should mention to us?
Wow, so what's interesting is I was thinking about as a kind of during the early part of the Trump years, I started referring to myself as being from the special administrative region of California. That actually within the United States, there's intense regional identity and local identity and there are things actually that I identify with as a Californian, or that actually resonate in certain ways with Hong Kong identity, of this kind of a local culture that's built in part of fusion and combining of different influences from different places. So it's not about speaking a specific language, but having things like California cuisine was early something that drew from different influences. But I'm still learning about Hong Kong, and I do think one of the as much as there's many negative sides to what's been going on in the last couple of years, of course, there's actually been a flourishing of Hong Kong studies. And actually, there's been more writing on Hong Kong and what makes it distinctive, including there's a new collection out, a series of Hong Kong literature and translation that John Minford, wonderful translator, translator of Chinese, but who spent a long time in Hong Kong and working with a lot of Hong Kong local translators, has put out a whole series of Hong Kong literature and translation. There's been some wonderful journalism by Hong Kong locals. The book Aftershock, which is just a wonderful book, my favorite book in many ways that's come out of the 2019 events. And it's a kind of collage of first-person accounts by mostly Hong Konger journalists about covering the movement. There's one from the mainland in there and one from Taiwan, but mostly they're local Hong Kongers. There's the Cha Journal that has published Tammy Ho's writing has been really wonderful as an entree for me to think about that. So there's actually been a flourishing of Hong Kong studies that is, I think, speaks to this idea of why I think there's much to be despairing about the political story of Hong Kong, but the cultural story, I think there are ways to be hopeful.
Great. I see two more people joined us. Hong Kong Stoic, do you have a question for Jeff?
I just want to thank Jeff and you guys for hosting this room. A quick question, Jeff. Like food is a big thing. You know how you touched on movies? And I think that to sustain the Hong Kong culture and identity, like how can we better incorporate food in a message to preserve that Hong Kong identity to a bigger audience?
Wow, that's great. I mean, I do think food is important. I think actually food is one of the ways to, to talk about how artificial the idea of a single unified Chinese culture is, because attachment to local foodways is so powerful. I thought it was really noteworthy and interesting that one of the ways that solidarity with the movement was expressed was by frequenting yellow restaurants, and that restaurant windows became turned into ersatz Lenin walls at a point. So there were lots of ways that the food got across there. But I think there's a common story here to tell about a distinctive Hong Kong style that connects things like the movies and the music and the food, that it's almost a kind of defined by both something that's very local and is very much a part of influences from different places that blend together without any one clearly dominating. And so I think there's a good story to tell about food and what makes it special. And I hope to see more Hong Kong restaurants as one way of keeping that identity alive.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Hong Kong Stoic. Do you have a follow-up question?
No, I'll pass it to Yvonne.
Yvonne?
Oh, hi. Thanks, Carmen. Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
I really enjoy your talk, and it's really inspiring. So my questions is it's a little bit of off-topic one. So because I just spoke to some Hong Kong young people, and then they do have a lot of hope, and they do have a lot of like a belief that in their lifetime there might be an opportunity to build a nation or to build a country outside of China, and to build a state for Hong Kong. What would be your words, your wisdom, for these young people in Hong Kong or outside of Hong Kong about this?
So I don't know. I think the grounds for hope when I think about it, because I think there's a lot to be despairing about, but I think the grounds for hope is partly the fact that we just don't know what's around the corner, and that many situations that seemed objectively hopeless, something changes in the world that opens up different spaces. I just think about the kinds of situations that seemed so intractable that I just felt when I was younger, like I would never in my lifetime see the end of things. It seemed for years and years that apartheid in South Africa was simply going to keep existing, even though there was, there were struggles, but they were so suppressed. I thought, in a few years before the Soviet Union unraveled, people weren't saying the Soviet Union's about to unravel. They thought of it as something that was just going to last and last. And so, I think it's wrong to be naively optimistic that things don't always, and sometimes things can improve and then slide back in another direction. Burma seemed to me as though it was always going to be a dictatorship, and then amazingly it opened up and now it's closing down again. So but I think the fact that history shows these things that seem to be impossible sometimes happen is something to keep the spirit alive. And when you mentioned young Hong Kongers, I do want to give a shout out. There's a beautiful new, very short book by Hannah Mahan Davis. That's a kind of a memoir and a love letter to Hong Kong by somebody who's now living outside of it and feels she probably can't go back. But she's of the generation born around the time of the handover, and she's already writing a book about it. So I just think she was the youngest person I interviewed for Vigil, and she when I asked her what novel or film there was that helped think about Hong Kong, she was the one who brought up the Hunger Games and really made me pay attention to that at a time before the Burma had gotten people thinking about that as much as they are now. So I think her book you can find on Amazon, Hannah Mahan Davis.
It's my PTR. If you guys PTR, I put it up.
Great. It's an inspiring and beautifully written short book, and I think it's inspiring for young Hong Kongers to read because it's by somebody of that generation. And I think there are things to be inspired by just how articulate and effective at communicating things some very young Hong Kongers. I mean, not so young, but people like Nathan Law and Jeffrey No and Washington, D.C. I mean, these are people in their 20s, and I think it's really striking for to find those kinds of voices. And maybe that's something for optimism, not just about Hong Kong, but in some other places. The most inspiring anti-gun, the gun control activism, the most daring part in the United States were teenagers several years ago, and the climate strike people. So there is that, I think, speaks to a kind of hopefulness that's very important at a moment when objectively there's just enormous amount to be despairing about the world, not just about Hong Kong, but many places.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. So we are at 10:59 Eastern time right now. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but if we can take one short question, if there's anyone who would have a question. If not, I think this will be the end of the event today. And thank you so much again, Jeff, for being here and talking to us about your book and about Hong Kong. It is so inspiring, as some of the you already said. And also thank you everyone who joined us today. As so mentioned, we will have a series of this event on this clubhouse room. So watch out for us, and we will have another one coming up in 3 weeks. Follow us, the speakers here, if you want to know more about our future events. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. And I also like to remind everybody to join the Telegram group Hong Kong Books, HONGKONGBOOKs, and we will post our announcement over there. And also the book that mentioned by Jeff will be posted there. And since Jeff talked about Hong Kong culture and Hong Kong food, I probably will buy you a dinner at the Samu and Culver and Urban Center Drive.
Thanks.
I'm local in Orange County too.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Okay. Glad to hear
and
that. Thanks.
right, and well, as Jeff mentioned, the protests in the mainland disappear. The protests in the 80s disappear, and then the film of the Hong Kong films are very, very attractive. So Hong Kong books curators strive to protect the culture of Hong Kong, and currently we have projects to have books that let everybody know that are on the verge of being extinct. So again, I encourage you to join the Hong Kong books, and also encourage you to join 又係呢度. Here we are again, the club, and then the moderators all about here. Thank you everybody for coming here tonight. And then,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me. I really felt special to be able to do this. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah, I will probably let everybody have the time to join the club and follow the moderators up here, and then probably just wait another 1 minute, and I will end the room.
Great. Thank you, Axel.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, especially thank the audience to come here tonight to hear the talk, and then we will have a series of talk in future. I think 2 weeks later we will have Chris, right?
Yes, Chris will join us in 3 weeks. I think the 29th is the day. And that session will be in Cantonese. And then we also have another session scheduled for early August with Albert Wan of Bleak House Books in Hong Kong.
呢間房咧係雙語房嚟嘅，咁就如果我哋係用英文打嘅咧嘅 title 咧，就應該講英文嘅；如果係廣東話講嘅咧，就應該會打中文字。again 多謝各位今日嚟嘅參與啦。記得要 follow 我哋嘅呢間房同埋 follow 上面嘅 moderators。咁咧以後嘅show 咧你就會有個 notification 噶啦。多謝各位。
多謝各位。